electoral results directly. And in a theoretical perspective, this is probably also a little bit to be seen whether we can refine this a little bit. But the idea was actually, whereas most of the literature either thinks that voters are myopic, ignorant, or are outright incompetent, so to speak, and focus directly on the strategicness or strategic activities of governments, we put a little bit more the strategic options of voters into the foreground, and think that this might be an interesting example for this kind of literature, which is currently rapidly being developed. So these are the key things. As you have seen, we have run a bunch of regression models with different specifications using this annual cross-country data set on vote intentions, public opinion, so to speak, the Sunday question: which party would you vote for if there was an election next Saturday or Sunday? And we find that in almost all of the specifications, at least when it comes to the relationship between the size of fiscal consolidation and the public opinion effect, there is a quite interesting effect in the range of, let's say, around 0.5 to 1, if not more, percentage points in the vote. So we think that there is actually reason to be concerned, and especially because previous literature kind of overlooks these kind of strategic effects that come from the voters, and especially also these kind of the empirical red tail that implies in terms of problems of selection, etc., etc. So this is the main punchline of the paper, and I leave it at that. Thank you very much. I think we can't hear you.
Christina, we can't hear you.
I'm muting and unmuting, unmuting the microphone. Thank you, Achim. I'm going to give the first word to Stephanie.
Okay, thank you very much. You know, I've seen this paper before. Can you guys all hear me? Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've seen this paper before, and I've commented on it before, and it's a real pleasure to see it sort of develop and expand. I really like it. I liked it the first time, and I like it even better now. So I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions, but again, I think that it's a good paper, and these are just ways to push forward in the future. So one of the things that I've mentioned to you before is that surely the type of cuts have to matter. And you guys are really abstracting away from that. We know that it's virtually never the case that governments are cutting 10% across the budget, right? They're picking out key budget items that are more painful to some people and less painful to other people. And so I'm really curious to push you on this issue. And even Pearson, who you draw on, I mean, he's not sort of talking about these big, broad, across the budget cuts. He's talking about sort of really targeted programs that are painful to certain groups that have a lot of political power. So I'd push you again on that issue. And I guess a simple suggestion on this point, because it sounds like you have data on cuts versus taxes, that might be interesting to see if you see different reactions to spending cuts versus tax increases. Relatedly, I mean, you sort of say over and over again, you know, we're focusing on the median voter, it's about the median voter, and you're assuming that everyone, or at least a large majority of the electorate, is really opposed to austerity. And so I think I could be convinced on that point, but you're really putting all your eggs in this median voter basket. And so, you know, in some of your sample countries, they're not pluralities, you know, they're not even single party majority governments, right? And so I don't have a great suggestion here, but maybe you're throwing away a lot of useful data by looking at the sum of the vote intention for all government parties. And I wonder if it would get you anywhere to examine support for key parties. You know, does support for the party of the finance minister decline by more than, say, the party of the sports minister or the culture minister? So I just wonder if you could sort of be a little bit more nuanced there. And you certainly have these data, and you have a theoretical argument that would allow you to make some more nuanced distinctions there. I've raised this point before, and I'll raise it again. I don't know if it's reasonable, but you know, in some of your sample countries, governments can time both cuts and elections, right? So you have strategic governments that are timing their elections, and presumably, I think this might be artificially inflating the size of your effects. So if you have strategic governments that are calling snap elections when they're high in the opinion polls, and then they know they can get these cuts through, then the opinion or the support has farther to fall. So I almost wonder, by not dealing with this issue of early elections, you might be artificially inflating your results. So again, I don't know if there's something you can do there empirically or theoretically to sort of say, we know that governments can time not only the cuts, but also the elections in some circumstances. I think your argument makes sense. I think it's very clever to think about opinion polls as signals from voters. But empirically, so I think theoretically your argument is very innovative. Empirically, your test sort of boils down to our conventional wisdom about honeymoon effects. And there's a lot of evidence on this. There's a lot of literature on this. So I wonder if there's something you could do empirically that would be more innovative, that would link your innovative theoretical argument more closely to the empiric. So I have a couple of suggestions. One, I wonder if you can show that governments actually stop austerity or reverse austerity. Can you show that empirically, controlling for time to elections? And interestingly, can you show us that, the larger the fall in public opinion, the more likely they are to stop or cut or reverse? That would be very compelling. I wonder if you could show us evidence that response rates sort of correspond with your arguments, right? So if your argument is true, we should see people anxious to be polled, right? Especially these angry voters should be like, yes, please poll me. I want to express my opinion to the government. So I wonder if you could track response rates in line with the logic of your argument. I'm curious as to why you don't look at lower order elections. I think that would be, it might be a separate paper. I know that's a lot of work, but it would be certainly a nice supplement to the public opinion data. And I wonder if you could show us, again, maybe it's a separate paper, it's a big ask, but it would be certainly interesting to see if tying this back to elections, because you can lose a lot of support without losing office, as you rightly point out, but ultimately we and investors arguably care about government turnover. Can you show us that governments are more likely to lose office if they don't react to this public opinion? Because I assume there's variation in your sample in how reactive public opinion is. Can you then show us that the observational implication of your argument plays out, that if they don't react, they're more likely to lose office than if they do react? I think that would be just a really airtight case. I've asked you this before, and I'm still not sure I get it, why government ideology doesn't play a role in your argument. I would sort of assume that voters might punish left governments more for deep austerity than right governments. That would be consistent with some of my research and some of my findings. So, I mean, maybe you don't need it. Maybe you just are really convinced ideology doesn't matter. And at the end of the day, I think a really key question remains unanswered. Why are governments doing this if they know they're going to be punished by voters? And I am certainly sympathetic to the idea that it's because they're coming under pressure from the IMF, from the Troika, right? They have to make these cuts. I totally am sympathetic to that argument. But then why would they ever stop doing it? Right? So you're in this awkward situation where you kind of want to have it both ways. You want the government to be responding to voters sometimes, and then responding to international pressures, either the IMF or market pressures other times. And so I feel like you're in this difficult situation where they kind of are playing two masters, and it's not always clear to me when they're playing to which master. So, but overall, as I said, I think it's a great paper, and it's come so far, and I really like it.
Thank you, Stephanie. So we used to just give our paper givers a couple of minutes to maybe respond quickly, or if you want, we can go on and have one of our other discussants give you comments. It's really up to you. But if you choose to respond to Stephanie, I would urge you to be short.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. It's nice seeing you for the first time, by the way. Actually, so just apologies. We have seen your comments, or I have seen your comments only last week. And so in the last couple of days, we were actually chasing after another 30 observations rather than trying to implement some of the changes you proposed. So I can be very short because I take many of your comments as very helpful ideas to perhaps to develop in the future. As you have said, if you do too many things in the same paper, it's going to explode. So the election story is something Thomas and I had thought about before, whether we want to include it. But just very briefly, because these two things are probably related to each other, we very much talk about whatever that means to pivotal voter, right? And we are really curious, more or less, on the aggregate effect, and not on effects of subspecies of certain types of voters, let's say. So, and trying, but we agree that probably there's much more conditionality in these effects that we so far have seen. And one way to go was the idea of including sort of an interaction effect with the size of welfare state redistribution, where you actually can show or see whether countries differ in that sense, right? But you could make similar arguments about government ideology, which we have tried so far. Maybe we were not very successful, but we didn't find very much. And my hunch would be that's because there is not much of a difference in many, at least proportional voting system countries between the main opposition, the main parties of choice. If you think about German Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, maybe sometimes there's a difference, and maybe some of them are more kind of lenient towards contractions. But essentially, these parties should also track each other, right? And this is a little bit the idea of political competitions we try to give in this paper. But I leave it at that. All the other, I mean, all of the comments are well taken, and we need to develop them much further. Thank you.
Thank you, Achim. Welcome, Yotam. It's good to see you.
Hi, everyone.
Nice to meet you.
Same.
I'm going to give you the next word because you have some time constraints. So please go on.
Okay, thanks, Christina, and thanks. Hi, everyone. And thanks for everybody, for Christina and Raymond for organizing this amazing forum. It's really, I think it's a great initiative, this IPES virtual. So very briefly, I'll say a few words on I had some similar reactions also to Stephanie's. And I'll add just a few additional comments. So first of all, I think it's a very interesting paper, and I enjoyed reading it. And I think it's a very nice project that really has promise. I think I'll just give a few suggestions of places where I thought that you can clarify or sort of strengthen the argument. The first one, I would say that it's not entirely clear from your description what exactly you assume to be the government's rank-ordered preferences. So you kind of describe the choice to austere as if it's the first best for governments. So it's not clear whether it's an ideological preference or what exactly it is, but it's described as a first best, whereas you might think that in many cases they're basically doing it exactly as Stephanie also suggested, that there's the alternative is letting the debt increase, or some other more threatening scenario. Could be the IMF, could be any other, the Troika, could be some other external threat that they could see as a bigger concern, and therefore they're choosing to austere. So I think that one area where it would really make sense to start sharpening the argument is by actually being more explicit about what exactly you perceive to be the rank-ordered preferences of the government in terms of the actions. And I think that this also links to my second point, which has to do with a signaling story. So I think it's an interesting direction. It's not clear to me why you think it is a signaling story. So even after going over the model, I think it's entirely plausible that in the immediate aftermath of the decision to sort of the beginning of austerity, that voters initially aren't paying too much attention, and that they're basically responding mostly to the fact that things aren't going well. And so that when we're seeing a dip in the government support, this is the reaction. And that this has very little to do with signaling. So before the election, that's the time they tune in and they learn about essentially the counterfactual of how much worse it could have been if the government didn't take the austerity route, and then they come to re-support the government. And so all I'm saying is I'm not sure that this is what's going on, but I'm saying this seems to me as plausible of a story, and that if you're going to be telling the signaling story, then you need a little more in terms of what exactly would tease this apart from other stories that seem to me at least as plausible. And that's sort of one that I thought that you provide some evidence in favor of it, but that there are certainly other alternative stories that you need to consider more seriously. And that also links to the next comment, which has to do with the dependent variable. So I'm not entirely sold on why we care about changes in popularity in polls in an annual sort of from year to year, right? I mean, somebody might say all we should care about are just the election results, and that, you know, in theory, you could have looked also at midterm elections, if there are such, or even sort of in localities, but that, or sort of municipal elections, but that this idea of what is happening in the polls, well, many things happen in the polls during the elections, and governments take that into account also in their decision of when to austere. And so what we should ultimately care about is, do they get punished later on when it comes to the elections, but the changes on an annual basis mean very little. And so I think that if you're focusing on shorter time periods, then you need to also explain to us why politically it matters and what matters to the decisions of governments, or how they should bring that into their calculus, because it wasn't entirely clear. Then just stylistically, I think that the paper, because you have, again, a very sort of wealthy data, sort of rich data that is interesting, I think you need to do a lot more in terms of providing descriptive data. Particularly for the measure of consolidation, it would be very useful to present a number of just tables and graphs that will know what exactly this is capturing, and also make it clear how this differs from the traditional measures or the other measures of austerity. So, for example, you could include in the appendix a table that just shows the cases, also where there are disagreements between the different codings, and then try and walk through why you think that your measure is actually doing a better job in those specific cases. Because at the moment it's a bit of a black box. You kind of describe very briefly what goes into it, but we don't really know, and it's very difficult to know, is this truly a better measure. And also I think that you can give us data on the exact episode. So what countries are coded as austere, for how long, etc. All those things, you know, give us more confidence that this measure is capturing what you think it is, or what we hope it is. So I've got a bunch of other comments, but I'll just leave the last one. I think that your measure is partly based on government statements, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? So part of the decision of whether it's now, this is sort of particularly going to be endogenous to how parties' political concerns, right? So you choose to describe whether you're doing a serious austerity, or whether it's just a transition, or sort of all those statements are going to be exactly determined by your political calculus. And so then it seems a bit of a more complicated measure for what you're doing than the kind of Alesina measure, or all these other measures where they're saying, okay, this is objectively, or supposedly objectively, what they've done. Now let's understand what it does, as opposed to taking a measure that is already taking into account what you think it's going to do politically. And so I'm thinking whether there's something you can do about, first of all, explaining it, but also whether there's a way of taking out those statements from the measure, and seeing whether still you get similar results. So I'd leave it at that. But again, very interesting, promising, and I think that if you do those types of things, those changes and clarifications, then it really could take this further. Thank you.
Thank you, Achim. Do you want to respond a little bit?
Yeah, actually, I have not much to say, because again, I take most of these as helpful comments for the future. I think I have heard this comment before. Probably we need to think a little bit better about the empirical implications of the signaling story, and how to discriminate between what so far might be observationally equivalent explanations, or at least try to anticipate these a little bit and discard them in one way or the other, where we want to make headway. Just briefly, the polls question, I don't know, because it also comes up very frequently. Probably we need to make a better case in showing that the polls are actually a costly political signal, because that's the idea of a signaling story, right? There need to be some sort of a cost involved. And so just briefly, second order elections are, from my point of view, way too heterogeneous to implement them across such a bunch of countries. And the other thing is that I think the literature is growing on the relevance of polls for party politics, even throughout the legislative term, let's say, of a government, right? Because there need to be positions filled, there need to be kind of the ranks and files closed, and so there's and there's a lot of evidence that parties closely monitor the polls and also take these things seriously. So the question is, why is it costly from the voters' perspective? And there, so far we argued because of that, because they see that they cannot send out any type of information. But that obviously would is open for discussion whether this argument is very much convincing. As for the other things, yes, you're perfectly right with the statements. That's a brilliant idea. We need to think about it. Actually, we did this in a country case study on Germany a little bit, trying to sort out how reliable the De Vries IMF data is, but I couldn't answer this for the whole bunch of countries on the top of my head. Thanks again.
Good.
So Mark, do you want to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me? Everything good?
Yes.
Great. I suspect as we go further along, I'll be repeating things from the previous, and that's probably useful for Ari, because some things will be reinforced in terms of how things run. But I'll give it maybe a somewhat different spin. What I did like is this idea that in terms of what the ultimate, looking at the research question you have, which is how does fiscal consolidation affect government support, that you need some sort of model to think about what are the players themselves doing to be able to empirically test this. So the premise of the overall paper, when I first jumped into it, I thought, okay, this is really neat. People like me, I might run a regression, put these things in and assume, I push a button and I get a nice result. You're going to do the formal model that needs to be done to kind of trace these things out. You'll come up with something that's counterintuitive I didn't see before, and you'll explain something I didn't see. As I phrase that, I think you may be getting a sense of, I like the first part, I like the framing, I like the attempt at the model, but in terms of the results, I'm going to put it very brashly or bluntly, but more to provoke you, and to be in terms of how this runs. But what am I getting out of your model that is something I didn't expect to get in the first place? That is, ultimately, it sometimes seems to go to some of the earlier work that you and the co-authors have done of looking at, okay, you consolidate the first year, and by the fourth year, more or less, the effects go away. I've seen this in Stokes, 1999. Now she makes this argument that in Latin America, countries promise anything, presidents promise anything, so they win. I mean, Menem looks like a total left-winger. He becomes a right-winger when he gets in. He consolidates. All they care about is by the fourth year, you get some economic growth, right? And I'm looking for sort of what am I getting in your model that I'm not getting in these previous models, and why is your model better? I guess is the sort of the crass or more blunt way of putting it. I could see one model is sort of the Stokes one is that the reforms are good for you. They're painful for you short term, but they're always good for you long term. It could be I vote every year by my pocketbook. The first year it hurts. The second year maybe it gets a little better. That might be somewhat different than the assumptions in terms of what Stokes has, but I'm looking again for sort of what's the alternative model that you're putting on top and saying, no, I need this to be about signaling, not about pocketbook voting or some of these other things. And I think if you put it in that framework, it'll help you sell the paper. One other thing about that, just in terms of the model itself, I'm not always clear about what the role is of time. Because the first discussion is, am I sincere or insincere? Am I angry or am I happy? But then somehow insincere people over time become sincere in terms of how things run. And I didn't quite get the dynamic of that. And also if it's a repeated game versus a one-shot game, that might affect things. And so when you say I'm going to have to look at time dynamics, especially in empirics, maybe I read the formal model too quickly in the back, but I'm looking for sort of what are those time dynamics in terms of how that's set. So I got the repeated games. The other question I have, this falls on something that Stephanie mentioned, is just this idea of how do countries vary? Because what you have there is size of welfare state is really the only thing. I know she mentioned she'd like to see partisanship, that could be there, but when I think about the counter that you rebut is this ECB, sort of working paper that's passed around a lot that says that, oh, well, when you cut, you get better economic growth. And they pick on particular Ireland, Netherlands, Sweden, I think Denmark's in there too. These are places where unambiguously things got a lot better after they consolidated. Okay, there are other countries where you consolidate and things, well, Greece, for example, things don't look good. Maybe it would have been even worse. There are lots of places consolidated and things are quite bad. The debate about what are the effects of austerity in the first place on growth, your model assumes it's only one way, and I guess the question I have is, are there other things that differentiate this? And just a comment here, maybe it's because I'm an American in Germany and the three of you are Germans who work outside of Germany. But this sort of thing that, in terms of what's going on with the Germans, I mean, you know, you've got this idea that, well, you could propose this debt break, okay, the rest of Europe complains, that's consolidation. Then Schäuble, okay, he cuts 40 billion more than he needs to under the debt break, and today he has the black zero, okay, and he seems to win votes by saying, I promise you a black zero. It doesn't matter how the economy is doing or how many refugees we have or what's going on, we're going to have a black zero. That tells me that somebody likes this. Okay, and the premise that consolidation or savings is in general not something that you appreciate, and you might be happy and kind of against it, or angry and you're really against it. There got to be some places where you win. I think also the Dutch in their early 1980s. You know, there are places where, for some reason, that's there, and I don't. Maybe you say on average that just washes out or something, but that gets to something that Stephanie was referring to about partisanship or maybe just population differences. Now, a hypothesis I would have for that, it may also have something to do with your previous experience with crises. Okay, and what do you think happens if you don't consolidate? If the whole thing blows up and things are really bad, you may have, like the Swedes in the early 1990s or the Finns, you had this sense that we blew it, you can maybe win votes on this, right? And that gets to one other question, which is sort of the counterfactual that I'd like to see developed a bit more, which is, what happens if you don't consolidate? Okay, it seems to be kind of a story of, well, you can continue to provide public goods, but I don't know. I mean, it could be markets then withdraw the funding, and because the measure, if the measure has something to do with what is you're doing in terms of your budget balance, if your interest rate goes up, that's going to be a problem. And so I'm looking for very much, you know, kind of a story of, look, this country didn't consolidate, this is what happens, and this is how it fits my story. I should say, by the way, I think when I read your paper, I thought, this is Italy today. This is Renzi. He does a little bit of cuts. Okay, some people get mad at him. He stops. He looks around. How am I doing in the polls? Okay, so I should also add, I guess part of my conceptualization was I think this works for some countries, and it really helps explain Italy to me. But does it explain Germany today? And it might be you have a model that does, but I'm looking for ways to kind of bring that in. Consolidation, just... I know you're looking at this IMF data set, but it would be, and I think this follows up on something that Yotam said, you know, I'd like to see what's in this data. Okay, what's it look like across countries, across time? And I would even add, why not have some sort of anecdote to kick off the paper and compare two different cases or something like this? That would help me with the model and then also, I think, with the empirics. But what's a consolidation? I mean, at times the language is all about cuts. But if I take the country Stephanie's in right now, well, if you look at the UK, actually they've never cut spending. It's always gone up between 2010 and 2015. Now it goes up a little instead of a lot, but they have projections of how much it would go, and they make cuts off of the projections. Okay, and so when the language in the beginning is all about cuts, I'm like, well, what countries are you talking about? And then later you're like, no, it's really about, I think it's about projections, and then you're making adjustments. And then it's often about, no, this is what the real deficit was. Did you improve the deficit? But those are, I think, conceptually different things. If you're improving the deficit versus consolidating over plans, and then some of the data set, of course, is meant to capture, no, there's intent to consolidate. But it would be great to have more than just that paragraph. I mean, really kind of take it apart, discuss it, you know, say some things about what it is, and I think that nuance then will help you with the paper itself. Little things, I probably, like the rest of you, I've just got some comments that I can just send in terms of some of the details, but like growth, should it just be growth? Should it be the output gap? Maybe it depends where you are in the cycle. Some countries are going to be growing faster than others, so in terms of how you look at some of these things, you might want to have some other specifications. I should say it was impressive, organizational issue, very impressive, the different ways you look at it empirically. You're very careful in terms of how this goes. At one point I felt it was overkill. I mean, it would be nice to have a sort of, this is our finding. Okay, you don't believe us. Okay, here are 25 different robustness ways to look at it and see we're still standing. I kind of read it as, oh, here's yet another way you could tweak it, but what's the overall picture? And at times I got a little lost, but that's organization. So I enjoyed it. I hope the comments are useful, and look forward to seeing a future version.
Thank you, Mark. Achim, do you want to respond?
Yes, very briefly. So, hi, Mark. Thanks for the comments. It's kind of funny because I'm right now in Berlin as well.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yes. But, so most of the comments, again, I take and will give it a good thinking. I mean, we know that the game is very primitive and it's only a static game versus the actual argument, which also has dynamic implications. So I totally agree that we need to think about something like that. But maybe very briefly, so since it came up several times, cuts versus spending. I mean, there is differences in the types of measures you can take, and also in the ambitiousness you can do these measures. So it's very much surprising. We haven't really found a substantive difference for tax versus spending, and I don't know. Maybe that's an inconvenient truth for our story. We really need to reflect harder on that, what that means. But also in general, it's true. But I think that brings me to an interesting point, because I'm not really sure what to think about this myself. You said, what happens if you don't consolidate? Well, actually, we as a blueprint really had in mind kind of these smaller type of interventions of austerity, not the very big ones. I'm saying that because we know in the data, this data is non-normally distributed, right? So you do quite a few of years you don't do anything, and then you have to do main reconstruction, right? So this is this Baumgartner and Jones and all these people who show this with different types of budgets. So, but what this means to the data structure is actually that these large-scale interventions are relatively rare, kind of selected out of the data, and the main story we analyze is actually these smaller kind of changes. And in that sense, it's for us a little bit difficult then to talk about these crises as exogenous. I'm not even sure whether it's exogenous interventions, but this kind of idea when you have big crises. We try to use some crisis indicators, you know, the subprime crisis, the Swedish crisis, all this. But so far we haven't really seen a clear pattern in that. But other than that, I'm very thankful for the comments. Especially, maybe we should really think about having one or two anecdotal cases in there just to illustrate a little bit the different dynamics. So that's and all the other comments are very nice as well. So it will give us a good deal of additional thinking. Thanks again.
All right. So Bumba, hi.
Hi.
The ball is in your court now.
All right, fine. I'll keep it brief. I mean, the last mover advantage is you can free write. So I'll be doing a lot of that, up front. But all right. So Achim, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but I have three very brief points for your theory. Some of which were raised by Stephanie and Yotam and Mark as well. But my big first question is, why focus on the pivotal voter, or the median voter as such, and hence why focus on signaling, right? Why is this not simply a story of there's a distribution of policy preferences over fiscal consolidation or fiscal adjustment, and it's really about governments trying to respond to this, their information about this distribution among the set of voters out there. I mean, if there's a bunch of voters, I mean, there's clearly heterogeneous preferences over fiscal consolidation. It's not so much just about the pivotal voter. So I didn't really understand why you're prioritizing the role of the pivotal voter, except from a standard median voter framework, which again, I'm not very clear on why that will directly apply to these European parliamentary democracies where PR systems and different kinds of PR systems, where the median voter is not. It's not very obvious that the median voter, the pivotal voter, the term that you use, really plays a central role. So it's really about the distribution of policy preferences, and with respect to that, there's a pretty rich political economy literature. Some very nice formal models, especially from the 1990s by Alicina and Cohen, and so on. And it may simplify things for you as well in terms of modeling, rather than going to the Cho and Krebs kind of set of signaling models. So that's both a question and a suggestion. The second question that I have, again, in terms of your theoretical setup, is why is this not necessarily a theory of democratic accountability, if you will? And Mark kind of raised this, briefly in his comments. Is it's not so much that governments think about, signaling per se, but it's really their anticipation of electoral punishment. If that electoral punishment happens after they resort to fiscal policy consolidation, that may affect their policy decisions. And the idea, and this is very, very critical to the democratic accountability literature. You have this Farragon's model from '86, a very famous model. Farron did some work on this, and that Zhaborsky et al. Volume from 1999. He has a very cute model out there where he looks at and this builds off on Farragon's earlier work. Is it's so much about what governments really think is can voters really punish them in case they adopt certain policies that voters don't like, okay? And so it's really that strategic calculation that can drive this gambling on policy by governments. Is, hey, I don't think but that voters will punish me, or at least the threat by which the threat of being punished at the polls is not credible, for a variety of reasons. Ex post, and so ex ante, I can adopt these policies, take the risk of adopting fiscal policy consolidation. So, again, I'm not seeing why the story is not there, or why you've, not looked at this democratic accountability story. It may not matter at all, but at least I would think if you're going to the signaling framework, at least, make it more compelling. Okay, that's a suggestion. And the final suggestion that I have, or at least again a question for your theory, is, and this may sound a bit harsh, is it's where are the opposition parties? That's when I think about a model of electoral competition, is where's the opposition group in your story? Clearly in the policy positions that they're adopting, or the information they're transmitting about voter preferences, or about what their constituents want, matters to government policy making. Fiscal policy making. So I was a bit surprised. Maybe I've missed this in the paper, but I was a bit surprised there's very little discussion on that. So those are the three big theoretical questions that I have. Now, in terms of your empirics, I thought the data, and I think the empirics are really well done. For the most part, it's pretty compelling for a number of reasons. But again, I do have some questions. Maybe I'm not reading this right, but I just thought. When I read your theoretical story, I was wondering whether hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 1a, this is a standard reviewer's comment, is, shouldn't this be a conditional hypothesis? Right? It's, I mean, the choice or the degree of fiscal consolidation, will probably, in my view, at least in terms of your theoretical story, depend on either the pivotal voter type or on the distribution of voter preferences over fiscal consolidations, something like that. So that's the way I read, your theory, that it's giving this conditional kind of, interactive effect hypothesis, basically, or prediction. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's the way I read it. The other point that I have a whole bunch of points about your empirics, but again, I'll just keep this very brief. I'll just raise one more crucial question. Is Mark and Yotam talked about your fiscal consolidation data. I completely agree with them on that. I think you should certainly discuss that in your paper. But I was curious about the time series properties of the vote intention data. Having done some work in time series in the past, and I think Thomas Sattler has done some work on this as well. Is tell me something more about this. I mean, I think it varies a lot across these advanced democracies. I'm not so sure about it though. I mean, are they stationary? Are they fractionally integrated? Or if they're are they revealing different kinds of non-stationary behavior, across countries? I have no idea. If that's the case, you've got to be very careful about the models that you're choosing, your empirical models. If there's differences in the time series properties, and to that end, I would suggest, why don't you look at an error correction model? I mean, error correction models are particularly useful for dealing across these different. If the time series properties or distributions of the vote intention series vary across countries, you can get a good sense of the short-term and long-term effects on vote intention on of fiscal consolidation. I have a bunch of other points, but I'll just keep it at that. Okay. Yeah, I don't have any more major points to raise, unless I have more time.
So okay, Ahim, you can respond, and then I'll just open the discussion.
Yes, thanks very much. Nice to meeting you also for the first time. So again, I don't. That's much food for thought, especially when it comes to the theory. I mean, the three of us are more of empiricists and theoreticians, so probably we kind of stumble into a field where there's much to learn for us. It's also a little bit. It was kind of. It's for us actually even a more open question. With the signaling story, we kind of stumbled into this modeling world, and so we thought we should have at least some sort of an formal appendix to illustrate the claims. But actually, the main gist of the argument was supposed to be more non-verbal, but I take it that especially I haven't even thought about these democratic accountability models, and that's also part of maybe the paper, and also what we need to think about spinning the paper correctly. The three of us are political economists, so our point of departure was this kind of very political economy literature in that specific subfield, right? And there you see either very naive models of voter myopia, so you have voters who forget, or you have these kind of very elaborate Rogoff and Siebert models where you have a highly strategic government sending basically a signal, which means that only very tough governments can do stupid things, if I call it like that, right? So, and this was where we tried to basically put drive our wedge through the literature. I'm not sure whether this is always very helpful. What this means is actually that we downplay, obviously, the complexity of the polities of the different voting systems and all of it. And in a sense, as much as an kind of an implicit assumption as a real fully developed argument in the paper is that really the opposition kind of and the government parties, they move along with each other. So there is kind of, at least among the major competitors, there is kind of convergence. And obviously you can measure that, and you could try to look for differences and then build a richer story which really takes the whole distribution of preferences into account. We didn't do that, neither empirically, and that was one of the reasons why we don't do this theoretically. But it's obviously a fascinating idea, maybe also for follow-up papers. I think our paper would explode a bit, but it's definitely a great idea. And the same goes for all the other recommendations. I am especially thankful for the argument about the conditionality of the hypothesis, because that was, when I wrote it down, it also struck me as somehow probably confusing for the reader. So thanks again.
Okay, so basically, I think we have an open discussion. I know you have other points that you've withheld. It is the time to basically put them out there. We have ballpark 20-25 minutes to go, if we have enough comments and enough desire. So please go ahead.
Can I also ask a question later on?
Absolutely, it's an open discussion.
I just want to add, just to follow up, since I was the guy who went last, as I'm okay with the signaling story. I just don't want you to misunderstand my comments. I just get overexcited when talking, but But I think you just need to convince, I would think, a typical formal political economist that it's really about governments observing vote intention or polling data or whatever, and then adopting policy. And that's not very clear. That's very fuzzy. I mean, there are a lot of political economists who think exactly the other way around. It's really anticipation of what voters are going to do or cannot do that drives policy making at the outset. So that's all. I mean, I'm just saying, just take a position on that. And I think the literature tends to be, the theoretical literature at least, tends to be much more richer on the other side. Is its anticipation of what voters will do from the government's part that drives austerity policies and fiscal consolidation and so on. But if you can convince reviewers that no, that's not what really matters, either empirically, it's really they're observing this. I think your signaling story is fine, beyond certain, after adding a certain or making a bunch of certain corrections, basically. That's all I have to say.
Other thoughts?
So I have to go out in a couple of minutes, so I'll just quickly jump on Mark's comment earlier. Achim, would be helpful can you give us what would be a motivating example that you have in mind? So if you were to start with an anecdote, or what would be the examples that you think would best illustrate this dynamic of concerns about sort of the rationale for the signaling story? What would you think would be the best case that would illustrate why this logic is the one that we should believe? Because in a sense, I really thought I was willing to buy into it in some instances, but I think that it has many questions around it. It would be helpful if actually you walked us through one example of what you think is going on.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure whether I can really make a good case here, but one of the things we are doing now, we are coming up with a bunch of case studies and trying to understand a little bit better the dynamics at play. And one of the things one of our PhD students and I did was writing a short case study on Germany, where you actually see that in 7 out of the 10 last national elections, the two main camps, let's say, the two main coalitions to be formed, at least when it came to the electoral campaigning, so the Christian Democrats and the Liberals on the one side, and the Social Democrats and the Greens on the other side, they were always, in 7 out of 10 cases, they were close to each other right around the election time, in the ballpark of 1%, maybe 3%, or something like that, but not larger than 5. And only in 3 cases out of these 10 of these elections, there was actually a substantial margin that made the government assured that it will easily survive the next election. So the Kohl years were really fascinating, where you can see that basically the honeymoon effect wears out, and then right around the election time, basically there is a jump starting again of public opinion to its favor. So they always manage to turn to turn around, and only in 2 of these 10 cases there was actually endogenous timing involved, right? So where you can really say, okay, this is also due to the calling, the premature calling of elections. And when you look at these cases, you see actually what the government did. It really, in the Kohl years, started experimenting in how far it can go in certain measures, right? So it really did in the first couple of years usually some things that were meaner to the voters, and then well, obviously I don't have the smoking gun in my hand, but we know that the Adenauer Foundation pays a lot of these guys to do even private polls for them. And then they started to sounding out not only the polls, but also their own basis, how these measures work, and how much of a resistance will there be at place, right? And so we observe this pattern that it's kind of a trial and error system, and we think in that sense, although we have obviously no clear understanding from the position of the voters, but it's also interesting to look at the German case about, you know, the dimensionality of the policy space and the importance of other issues, or the chancellor itself as a candidate, right? And then you can basically compare these two pieces of information and see, okay, actually in most of these cases the chancellor remained popular. And in most of these cases, there was kind of an inbuilt bias towards the conservatives, but nonetheless, public opinion went down, right? And you saw that there was even, you know, you can even look at these cases and you see that there was a lot of strategic voting going on in these elections, trying to shift some part of the conservative votes to the liberals so that they managed to get across the hurdle. And so you see there was a lot of mobilization going on from the government side, but we also interpret this actually as evidence that they need to respond to voters that were disgruntled. But what does disgruntled mean? Apparently, they were not disgruntled in any sense, but only in specific senses. So we have a bunch of ideas how to illustrate it, but probably we are not yet ready to twist this into one or two really revealing cases. But I think if I had to make a good case, I think I would go back into the 80s and early 90s of Helmut Kohl, where there was this constant drain coming from German reunification and this experimentation and this kind of dynamics in public opinion.
So you're sorry, Christina.
Stephanie, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So your case study, your illustrative example, I have to admit I don't know that case particularly well, but it reminded me of a question that came to my mind when I was reading your paper, is that if your logic is true, parties should be pre-polling party policy ideas, and that certainly does not happen in the UK, right? So I mean, the party doesn't even poll on big election issues. Like just this last year was the first time you had a Conservative Party millionaire, doing polling for the party. I mean, that had never happened before. And that's certainly the case that they're not out there pre-polling party policy ideas, right? So I don't see the parties acting in a way that your argument seems to suggest, right? That parties are sort of feeling out the voters, trying to figure out where they are. They're not pre-polling policy ideas. In the UK, at least, they're not even polling on election outcomes, right? That's not what the parties are not engaged in, that sort of behavior. And so I don't know why not. I don't know if you think that that is an observable implication of your argument, but to me it certainly struck me as something given your argument, I should expect to see parties doing, and certainly they don't do that, at least in the country that I'm familiar with at the moment.
Yeah, actually, I don't have a quick answer to this, so I would really need to think more closely about the details. Okay, but what I do know is actually, I mean, bye. Zero, thanks again. What I do know is actually that in the German case there is extensive, not in the sense that they would commission, although I'm not even sure about that. I think even there has been cases like that, but I would actually have to ask some experts in the field, because that's not my specialty. But what I do know is that the way how, at least in the German case, it's portrayed is that there's this constant idea, perhaps not in the specific way, but you know, what's the most important problem, etc., etc., and also how is this related to general popularity of this specific candidate. And it's actually quite fascinating if you look then at the lower order elections, the kind of topics that come up and the kind of ways that is represented. You see that parties that the whole machinery of lower ranked party politicians starts usually building up this kind of steam in order to reach the top level. So not sure whether this is a good answer, but I have the feeling that if you dig a little bit, there might be some empirical illustrations of what we are looking for.
Mark, I was wondering whether you would want to say something about Germany. Because if I understood right, some of your earlier comments suggested that you thought Germany perhaps is not the best case.
Well, I guess I could respond. I mean, in some sense, what Achim was talking about is having, if he's got 10 elections, I was talking about more recent things. But I mean, the question is, I think what I was trying to get is maybe even a broader one, just this idea of under what circumstances can you win elections if you are being austere. And it has taken that turn here where there are a lot of criticisms about how sharp it is, but what Schäuble is doing now and what the CDU is doing is they're really, in some sense, saying, we would just simply have a balanced budget for the future in terms of how things run. And I think that's a general phenomenon in some places. And so, but I wouldn't necessarily, he's looking things, but at the same time, if he's got 10 cases and I have one, I guess in some sense I say okay. I mean, it would really depend in terms of I think how it's run. I would say, I mean, there are other times where sort of this at least is somewhat of an issue in terms of how things run. And I guess the other question I do have is, are there sort of cycles of this where there are periods where most parties are more, I don't know if austere is the right word, but where the deficit is really an important indicator. If you're bad on the deficit, your judge is incompetent. I think that would be my alternative model. There are some countries that's the case. Whereas in other countries, it's it's all about growth. You can have a somewhat high deficit, but if your growth numbers are too low, I'm going to say you're incompetent. And what I was looking for is there some way, I think what they look at in terms of their variable is, well, maybe it's the size of the welfare state. That might differentiate, because I see already some thought about, what would differentiate these. I also hear they looked at other stuff and it didn't work, like parties, or is it tax versus spending, or some of these other things. So, I mean, they've thought about these, but my prior is there's still something that differentiates these. That's not in the regression. That would be correlated with these other variables. But thank you for giving me, that was a good comment to allow me to push forward.
If I might briefly, one finger. So the German case, actually, in a case study we wrote, we actually tried even to motivate it as a least likely case. Not so much about the recent episodes, but the general idea that Germany is a fiscally conservative country, right? And if you see these kind of effects even taking place in Germany, where you would suppose that the general sentiment is actually very much one of profligacy or anti-spending, let's say. And if you see this in Germany happening, then you don't even need to think about Italy. I hope this doesn't sound racist. No, so this is the idea. And the second point about Germany is actually that in recent years, there's little to fear. And if you think about it, Germany doesn't do much. I mean, on the lower level, yes, they have the debt breaks. But on the national level, they have a debt break, and whenever they seem it appropriate, they forget about this Stability and Growth Pact. So they are actually not consolidating much, and most of the consolidation comes through negative interest rates and capital inflows. So, I mean, Germany is actually a very good case that you don't have to do anything if you don't have a problem. But I might exaggerate a little bit, but this was our interpretation of the recent round of elections in Germany.
Yeah, Bomba.
Yeah, my finger's been up for a long time. So just to, I guess my last question, this builds up on what Stephanie kind of raised, a while ago, but I think it's important, is in terms of identifying, your model, right? I mean, when I think about fiscal consolidation, and I could be completely wrong about this, so correct me, is it happens under certain circumstances. Either there's been, a debt crisis or some kind of a financial crisis, a banking crisis maybe, or there's been, sharp output losses. So, fiscal consolidations don't just come from anywhere. Governments just don't do it. At least I would think. I'm not very sure about Europe as such, but when I think about the developing world in general, it's almost always a response to some crises, whether it's a balance of payments crisis, debt crisis, or something like, or whether the IMF is coming in, as Stephanie mentioned, and putting pressure on these governments to take these fiscal reforms. So again, I'm just, when you're trying to identify your empirical model, are you being sensitive to all these confounding factors that are affecting, the decisions to engage in fiscal consolidation, leaving aside, concerns about vote intentions? I mean, this matters for model identification. You got to be very careful about that, right?
Yes, actually, shall I? Yes. Just very briefly. So this brings actually to one of my questions now, since I have this brilliant opportunity to kind of use your brains for my purposes, because this is really a thing we are thinking about. I think Stephanie also in one of her comments, probably in the first round she gave to us, she also made this idea that had this idea that you really need to discriminate between exogenous shocks that are the only kind of things that can actually trigger the whole sequence of arguments in a way that you can trace causality here, right? And I sort of agree, but unfortunately, it's really hard to think about what exogenous shocks means in the sense, right? Because I just recently, because I think Stephanie also prompted us to read more from what's his name, Lawrence Bross, and there is this literature on endogenous crisis, right? So even these crises are not really foolproof indicators of when the this chain of events should be started to be measured, and the same goes obviously for other kind of more formidable instruments of power like the Troika and the IMF, because you have very few instances in our data set where you really can see these kind of concrete supranational interventions. In a data set with developing countries, then probably that would be different. In the OECD context, you have UK in the 70s, perhaps, maybe a bunch of other cases where you could make the case, but only in the most recent episodes, perhaps. So it's very hard, and actually, so probably the underlying line, and I think this is something which is very close to Thomas's work, is the constant pressure from capital markets and the general problem pressure. And so what we try to do is we try to experiment with a little bit of these crisis indicators and really try to start a chain from what is supposedly to be an exogenous link. We weren't really successful in that, but I think one way to go would really be to make at least some illustrations when you see that actually when governments are really forced to implement consolidations at a time which is not convenient to them and not in a manner that is convenient to them, that actually the drop in popularity is very large. And I think we have some maybe some good case study evidence. For us, it's much harder to quantify that.
Stephanie, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought, but I'll just say one thing that that Boomba sort of triggered my concerns. It's very clear to us when we look at sort of what governments do in reaction to what the IMF requires them to do, that they'll do it, and then as soon as the condition expires, as soon as the IMF leaves town, they reverse it. So in your data, do we know that the cuts have stopped? I guess in your data, do we know that the cuts stop because of public opinion, or that the cuts stop and then public opinion improves? Are you able to sort that?
I mean, what we try to do is some sort of visualization, and we could plot this. What we don't have in this data is the reasons why they stop it, right? So
I just tell you, we have a graph in one of our papers that looks exactly like your graph in terms of the cuts that they're making in response to IMF conditions, right? It's sharp, and then it would be perfectly correlated with your public opinion graph.
Okay.
And so I guess that kind of makes me worried, like, are the cuts responding to public opinion, or is public opinion responding to the reversal of cuts? Because this backsliding is very common, right? Governments are doing it. They cut sharply and then they dial back. So your graph looks exactly like our graph, and I guess it's just being sure that you can mediate between those two stories.
Yeah, yes, thank you. I mean, this is really good. I mean, this comment has come up several times, so probably we really need to sort out observationally equivalent stories. I mean, to be honest, I know how this works in the publication business, but in general, I'm not even saying that we have a strong causality claim here. I mean, these things work forward and backwardly, and actually, Thomas and Evelyn's other work and a lot of people have done the reversed causality. So obviously, there's a back and forth. So what we try to do is we hedge our claims a little bit empirically, using the instrumental variables approach. I know this is far from being perfect, but it's not that I think these two stories are mutually inconsistent. I think, to the contrary, probably the more interesting story is that they are probably both there at the same time, and the real interesting story is how to figure out the exact let's not say even sequencing, but the amount which effect might be larger than the other one. So this would be my comment.
Okay. Mark, do you have a comment?
No, unfortunately, I need to get going, so I just want to say goodbye, and I really enjoyed it.
Right.
Thank you so much.
See you, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Very well done. Very
Thanks.
nice.
So we're basically at the end of our time, pretty much. I want to thank, well, in absentia, to Mark and Yotam, but then to our two other present discussants, to Stephanie and to Bumba. Achim, thank you for letting us kill and dissect your paper. Hopefully it will come out better as a result of this. Any last final thoughts from either our discussants or Achim?
No.
Thank you. So then we'll see you in another fora. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Christina.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.